Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. I have a very exciting video today. Today I'm here to go over all of my 5-star reads from 2018. I know a lot of people like to do like their top 10 favorite or some sort of subset of their 5-star reads, but I don't like to pick between my 5-star reads. Sure, in a few years, some of these 5-star reads will stand out over others, but in this moment, when I'm still within a year of reading them, these are all basically on the same level for me. The only 5-star reads that I'm not including in this video are going to be the ones that were rereads, which in 2018 were a lot of Wheel of Time books. So these are going to be all of the new to me books that I gave 5 stars in 2018. And I'm just going to be going over them in chronological order. Like I said, it just hurts my heart too much to try and put these in an order. So chronological is much easier for me. I have 16 of these books to go over, so I'm going to keep my thoughts on them fairly short. But you can always check out some of my wrap-up videos where I go into more depth on these books if there's something that catches your interest. The first 5-star read that I had in 2018 was The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the First Era Mistborn trilogy. This wasn't my first time reading Brandon Sanderson. I've read one of the Wheel of Time books that he wrote, as well as the first book, maybe the first 2 in the Stormlight Archive series, but that was years ago, way before I started reviewing books online. So as you probably know, the Mistborn series is an adult high fantasy series. One thing that I absolutely love about this book and the series is the world and the magic system. It has a hard magic system. It's almost science-like, but it's not. It's definitely magic. This first book in the series, a lot of people describe as a heist, and while I agree with that, I actually think of it more as like a revolution. I just think that this story is on a bigger scale than just like a typical heist book, but it has, you know, the group of misfits who are working together to accomplish something. Like a lot of Brandon Sanderson's books, the last, I don't know, half, but at least the last quarter of the book was action-packed and suspenseful. I really love this book for the introduction to the world and the characters, and the ending was really satisfactory. The next book that I gave 5 stars was Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is an adult sci-fi thriller, and I said in a previous video that this was my most unputdownable book of the year because it was so crazy. From the very beginning of the story, crazy things start happening and they don't stop until the end of the book. I actually listened to this on audio and I thought the narration was really good, and I listened to it in like 2 sittings because I could not stop listening to it. Not only was it really fast-paced and thrilling, it also had characters that I cared about, relationships that I cared about, and it left me with a really thought-provoking ending that I did not see coming. This will be a favorite book of mine for a really long time. The next book that I gave 5 stars was The Crimson Crown by Cinda Williams-Chima. This is the 4th and last book in the Seven Realms series. I started this series in 2017, I'm pretty sure, and I have really enjoyed every book in it, but I especially enjoyed this last book. This is a YA high fantasy set in a really interesting world. In this world, magic is stored in what they call flash pieces, and a lot of times they wear them around their neck, and they can use up that magic, but they can also fill it back up. It's like a reservoir of magic that they carry around with them, and there's a lot of different classes of people in the book. You follow Raisa, who's a princess, but also Hans Alistair, who is a kid who grew up on the streets. I've really enjoyed the series as a whole, but I thought this last book was a really solid ending. It's not often that the way that a series ends is completely satisfactory, but I really love the way that this one ended. I thought it wrapped up all the things that I wanted to be wrapped up in a way that I liked. I definitely want to read more Cinda Williams-Chima. I know she has a second series set in this world that's set much later in time, I think like a generation later, and I'm really excited to read that one. The next book that I gave 5 stars was The Boy on the Bridge by M.R. Carey. This is the second book in the Girl with All the Gifts duology, and while it's a prequel, I would recommend reading it after reading The Girl with All the Gifts. This is a post-apocalyptic fiction that's a unique take on zombies. One of the things that I loved about this book was that one of the main characters was neurotypically diverse. He seemed to have Asperger's and was really high-functioning, but definitely struggled when it came to communicating with people. The plot was action-packed and always kept me guessing, and it was a lot of fun, and the way that it ended tied together, the first book and this one, and I just loved it. The next book that I finished was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which is the first book in the Strange the Dreamer duology. I had already read the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy and loved it by Laini Taylor, so I had high hopes going into this book, not to mention it had already been super hyped. Even though I pre-ordered this book, I didn't get around to reading it until a long time after it had already come out, which is why I hardly ever pre-order things. This is a YA high fantasy about Laszlo Strange, who is an orphan that works in a library and is obsessed with books in this mysterious city called Weep. The story is a lot more than that, but that's all I knew about it going in. And Laini Taylor did not let me down. She has a beautiful writing style, but on top of that, she's just so creative. Like, the ideas that she comes up with to put in her books are unique and different, and it's like a fresh breath of air. Also, the way she writes her relationships and her romances, she makes me feel all the things that her characters are feeling, and that's one of the things that I love about her books. Then I gave The Sea of Tranquility by Katja Millay 5 out of 5 stars. This is a YA contemporary romance that I had seen on a lot of people's favorites lists way back in like 2014, 2015, but I never picked it up because I just don't generally gravitate towards contemporary romances. This one is about a main character who had some sort of trauma in her past and has chosen to be a selective mute, and she moves to a new school and she meets a boy who also has some trauma in his past, and the two of them fall in love. Going into it, I wasn't sure how much I was gonna like this, but I absolutely loved it. This book really got to my emotions. I fell in love with the two characters and their story. Now that I'm looking back on it, I realize the story did have some flaws, but while I was reading it, I was totally sucked into the romance, and I had a really good time reading it. The next book that I gave 5 stars was A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. This is the third and final book in the Shades of Magic series, and I personally really love the series. I know that there are a lot of fans, but there's also a lot of people who don't particularly like this series, but I fall into the fan category. I really enjoyed it, especially this last one. This is an adult high fantasy set in a world with parallel Londons that all have different degrees of magic in them. One of the things that I love about this book and this series is the world, but I also love all of the characters. And in this final book, V. Schwab does a good job of raising the stakes, and things get pretty serious at the end. And at some points, I wasn't sure how things were going to work out, but in the end, I thought it was a really satisfactory ending to the trilogy. I believe that she's planning to write some more books set in this world, and I'm definitely looking forward to them. The next book that I gave 5 stars was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. I think in my last video, I said everything you never told me when I mentioned this book, and I was really embarrassed about that. This is an adult contemporary, which isn't usually the type of thing that I like to read, but at the time I was trying to expand my horizons, and I'd heard so many good things about Celeste Ng as an author, and so I was excited to try her out, and I was not disappointed. So this book is about a mixed race family. The father is Chinese and the mother is Caucasian. You see points of views from everyone in the family, including the parents and the children. There are 3 kids that are obviously mixed kids. The way that the book opens is that you learn that one of the daughters has died. So you go through the book knowing that she's going to die, but you piece together everyone's perspectives on how this ended up happening. This book really explores what it's like for mixed families and some of the racism that they experience, especially considering that it's set starting in like the 70s, so it's a little bit historical. And I really connected to the main character, Lydia. The story was just so touching and really spoke to me, and I loved it so much. And then directly after finishing that book, I went on to read Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, which was her second book, and I like this one even more than Everything I Never Told You. This book also touches on issues of racism, but in a different way, and it's also a book that's kind of hard to explain. You are seeing from multiple different people who are living in a community called Shaker Heights. One of the families is a rich upper class white family. You also have a artist and her daughter who are also white. But then there's also this other story that kind of weaves in and out about a Chinese baby who's being adopted by a white family in the same neighborhood. I just loved how Celeste Ng was able to weave all of these stories together and explore the themes of racism and classism and motherhood. This book really made me think about how you can't judge other people based on what you see, because you never know what their history is like and the things that they've gone through or are going through underneath the surface. And I just loved it. My next 5-star read was Cricket Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. This is the second and final book in the Six of Crows duology. I don't know why I waited so long to read this book. I loved it so much. It was so much fun. This is a YA high fantasy set in the Grisha-verse, and it comes after the Grisha trilogy, but you also don't have to read the Grisha trilogy to read this one. I personally would recommend that you do, but you don't have to. This book takes our favorite characters from the Six of Crows and continues their story. There's another heist going on in this book, and I love heist stories. I thought this book was suspenseful and fun, also a little heartbreaking, but I loved it so much. And I can't wait for Leigh Bardugo's next book, King of Scars, to come out, which is also set in this world and centers around my favorite character from this universe. The next book that I finished was Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. This was an adult horror book, and it was actually a debut, which surprised me because it was really good. So in this book, there are 4 or 5 horror authors that get invited to stay overnight or maybe the weekend in a haunted house. It goes over them being in the house, but also extends afterwards to some of the things that happen to them after they stay in the house. Not only was the plot of this book really interesting, but all of the characters were really interesting, and the book was very meta about the horror genre in general because they all write different kinds of horror, and there was a lot of talk about the different types of horror out there, and I really enjoyed that. It was just a really fun horror book, and I can't wait to see what Scott Thomas comes out with next. My next 5-star read was A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir, and this is the second book in the An Ember in the Ashes series. This is a YA high fantasy set in a Roman-inspired world. The world is a little on the brutal side, but what I love about this series are the characters. The characters are so complex. Somehow Sabaa Tahir has made like a love square that I enjoy reading about and can see why all of the characters are conflicted in the ways that they're conflicted. And it's not just that the romances are complicated, but even the friendships are really complicated. And I just love the complexity of the relationships in this book, as well as the world and the plot. Some kind of crazy things happened in the second installment, and I need to know what's going to happen in the next book. But I'm also putting it off because the last book in the series isn't coming out till 2020. The next book that I gave 5 stars was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is an adult high fantasy set in a Russian-inspired world. I had some high expectations going into this one just because I loved Uprooted last year, and this book had been getting a lot of good buzz before I picked it up. I can happily say that I was not disappointed, even though I know some people have been. I really love the themes that this book explores. There's a lot of feminist themes and looking at family and traditions while still being set in a fantasy world, which I thought was really cool. On top of that, the setting is gorgeous. This book is so atmospheric. It's set completely in winter, and I just felt so cold while reading it, and I could just imagine these beautiful wintry landscapes. There are these fae-like creatures called the Starrick, and I just want to know more about the Starrick. I think they were fascinating. I wish that they had their own book. I do think it might be one of those books that grows on you after you finish reading it, because the instant, or like the week that I finished it, I actually gave it 4 out of 5 stars, but then the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I love this book, and I bumped it up to 5, and now I can't imagine why I ever gave it 4 stars, because I loved it. I have nothing but fond memories of reading this book. My next 5-star read was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This is a memoir about Trevor Noah's life. It tells anecdotes of things that he experienced while growing up in South Africa as a half-black and half-white child. All of the stories were so interesting and funny, but also made you really think about what they were saying. I also listened to this on audio, which Trevor Noah narrates himself, which is how I would recommend reading this book. I went through a whole gamut of emotions during this book. I laughed many times, but I also sobbed. I was already a fan of Trevor Noah, but now I don't want to say obsessed with him because I'm not obsessed, but I do watch more of his stuff now than I did before I read this book. My second to last 5-star book of 2018 was The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. This is, again, another memoir. I read both of these during November in my little attempt at nonfiction November. The memoir mostly focuses on Jeanette Walls' childhood. She grew up pretty poor with unconventional parents who had very interesting ideas about how life should be. Let's just say they weren't great parents, but at the same time they did love their kids. It was just really interesting to see her perspective on her parents and the way that she can see the truth about how she was raised, but at the same time still love her parents because they are her parents. I found this book to be really thought-provoking and also touching. I cried at the end. And then last but not least, definitely not least, my last 5-star read of 2018 was The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. I said earlier that I don't like to rank my favorites, but I do like to try to pick at least one that is the favorite out of the year, and I have settled on The Well of Ascension as that favorite book, with the slight caveat that I did only just read it in December, and there's a chance that it's only ranked so high because it was such a recent read. But I really love this book and it sort of blew my mind, so I think that it's safe to say that it was my favorite. This is the second book in the First Era Mistborn trilogy. So I read the first book back in January and then I read the second book in December. It is definitely different than the first book. This book takes place during a siege, which I can see why some people would think that was boring, but it meant that there was a lot of political stuff going on, as well as uncovering of secrets and things. And then the ending was just like explosive. What I loved about it wasn't just all the stuff that happened leading up to the end, but just like the genius behind the ending. The way that this book ends made me rethink everything that I had known about the whole series up until this point. And that's what I loved about it, and that's one of the reasons why it got 5 stars from me and is one of my favorite books. I don't want to overhype it for other people out there because I realize now that not everybody loves this book as much as I did, but I can't lie and say that it wasn't mind-blowing because it was, and I loved it so much, and it is definitely my favorite book from the year. Alright guys, those are all of my 5-star reads from 2018. Hopefully I was able to keep my thoughts fairly short, but also convey why I love these books so much. I had a really great reading year, and I hope that 2019 also has a lot of 5-star books in store for me. If you liked any of these books, or even if you didn't like them, if you disagree with anything that I said, please let me know in the comment section, but nicely, please be nice. Obviously, we can all have different opinions on books, and that's okay. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. So as you probably know, bleh, I'm talking way too long. The series itself, but I would recommend it reading it after. Ugh. It was really. Blah, blah, blah. This one's about a girl named Natalia, but it meant that there was a lot of political. I hope that 2019 has a lot of bye.